Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus Africanus Numantinus, also known as Scipio Aemilianus Scipio Africanus Minor, was a politician of the Roman Republic. He was elected consul twice. On both occasions he was under the age required to be a consul, but an exception was made, so that he could take the command in wars in which the Romans struggled to make headway. In 147 BC, he took over the command of the Third Punic War and besieged and destroyed Carthage. In 134 BC he took over the Numantinus War, restored the discipline of the Roman army, besieged Numantinus and destroyed it. He was a prominent patron of writers and philosophers. Family. Scipio Aemilianus was the second of two sons of Lucius Aemilius Paulus Macedonicus, and his first wife, Paeperia Massinus. Aemilius divorced. The two sons were adopted by two prominent patrician families. The older one was adopted by a son, a grandson of Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus, and his name became Quintus Fabius Maximus Aemilianus. The younger one was adopted by Publius Cornelius Scipio, the eldest son of Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, whose mother was Aemilia Tertia, the sister of Aemilianus. His name became Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus. Through Aemilia, his adoptive father was also his cousin. Aemilius had two sons from a second wife whose name is unknown. He also had two daughters. We are not told who the mother was. The two other sons died just before and just after the father celebrated his triumph for his victory in Greece. First involvement in a war. Lucius Aemilius Paulus took his two older sons with him in his campaign in Greece. Plutarch read that Scipio was his favorite son because he saw that he was by nature more prone to excellence than any of his brothers. Quote, he related that, during mopping up operations after the Battle of Pydna, Aemilius was worried because his younger son was missing. Plutarch also wrote that the whole army learned of the distress and anguish of the general, and springing up from the suppers, ran about with torches, many to the tent of Aemilius, and many in front of the ramparts, searching among the numerous dead bodies. Dejection reigned in the camp, and a plain was filled with the cries of men calling out the name of Scipio, for from the very outset he had been admired by everybody, since, beyond any other one of his family, he had a nature adapted for leadership in war and public service. Well, then, when it was already late and he was almost despaired of, he came in from the pursuit with 2 or 3 comrades, covered with the blood of the enemies he had slain. Scipio Aemilianus was 17 at the time. First involvement in the Numantinus War. In 152 BC, the consul Marcus Claudius Marcellus urged the Senate to conclude a peace with the Celtiberians. The Senate rejected this, and one of the consuls for 151 BC, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, was sent to Hispania to continue the war. However, there was a crisis of recruitment, due to rumors about the incessant battles and heavy Roman losses, and with Marcellus appearing to be afraid of continuing the war, there was panic. Young men avoided enrollment as soldiers through unverifiable excuses. Men eligible to be legates or military tribunes did not volunteer. Scipio Aemilianus, who was thought to have advised the prosecution of the war, asked the Senate to be sent to Hispania either as a military tribune or a legatus, even though it was safer for him to go to Macedon, where he had been invited to go to settle domestic disputes, because the crisis in Hispania was more urgent. The Senate was at first surprised, but Scipio became popular, and those who had been avoiding their duty, ashamed by Scipio's example, began to volunteer as legates or to enroll as soldiers. He served under Lucullus. Velleius Paterculus wrote and was awarded a mural crown. Florus wrote that, having been challenged by the king to a single combat, carried off the spolia opima. Third Punic War. Although the power of Carthage been broken with her defeat in the Second Punic War, there was still lingering resentment in Rome. Cato the Elder ended every speech with "Carthage must be destroyed." Quote, in 150 BC an appeal was made to Scipio Aemilianus by the Carthaginians to act as mediator between them and a Numidian prince Mantine who, supported by the anti-Carthaginian faction in Rome, was incessantly encroaching on Carthaginian territory. In 149 BC Rome declared war, and a force sent to Africa, Carthage's homeland. In the early stages of the war, the Romans suffered repeated defeats. Scipio Aemilianus was a military tribune, and distinguished himself repeatedly. In 147 BC he was elected consul, while still under the minimal age required by law to hold this office. Without the customary procedure of drawing lots, he was assigned to the African theatre of war. After a year of desperate fighting and stubborn heroism on the part of the defenders, he took the city of Carthage, taking prisoner about 50,000 survivors. Complying with the mandate of the Senate, he ordered the city evacuated, burnt it, razed it to the ground and plowed it over, ending the Third Punic War. On his return to Rome he received a triumph, having also established a personal claim to his adoptive ignomen of Africanus. Numantine War. In 134 BC Scipio was elected consul again because the citizens thought that he was the only man capable of defeating the Numantines in the Numantine War. The Celtiberians of the city of Numantia, which had strong defensive geographical features, held off the Romans for 9 years. The army in Hispania was demoralized and ill-disciplined. Scipio concentrated on restoring discipline by forbidding luxuries the troops had become accustomed to, through regular tough exercises and by enforcing regulations strictly. When he thought that the army was ready he encamped near Numantia. He did not proceed along the shorter route to avoid the guerrilla tactics the Numantines were good at. Instead, he made a detour through the land of the Vacae, who were selling food to the Numantines. He was ambushed several times but defeated the enemy. In one of these ambushes by a river which was difficult to cross, he was forced to make a detour along a longer route where there was no water. He marched at night when it was cooler and dug wells which had bitter water. He saved his men, but some horses and pack animals died of thirst. Then he passed through the territory of the Gracchi, who had broken the treaty with Rome and declared that they could return safely to their homes. He returned to the Numantine territory and was joined by Jugurtha, the son of the king of Numidia, with 12 elephants, archers and slingers. Eventually, Scipio prepared to besiege Numantia. He asked the allied tribes in Hispania for specified numbers of troops. He built a circuit of fortifications which was 9 kilometers long. The wall was 3 meters high and 2.5 meters wide. He built an embankment of the same dimensions as the wall around the adjoining marsh. He built 2 towers by the river Durius, to which he moored large timbers with ropes which were full of knives and spearheads and were constantly kept in motion by the current. This prevented the enemy from slipping through covertly. He managed to force Numantia into starvation. The Numantines surrendered. Some killed themselves. Scipio sold the rest into slavery, destroyed the city and kept 50 men for his triumph. For his success Scipio Aemilianus received the additional ignomen of Numantinus. Political career. In 142 BC Scipio Africanus was a censor. During his censorship, he endeavored to check the growing luxury and immorality of the period. In 139 BC, he was unsuccessfully accused of high treason by Tiberius Claudius Acelus, whom he had degraded when censor. The speeches he gave on that occasion were considered brilliant. Scipio helped his relative Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, who in 134 BC had served in the Numantinus War as a quaestor under the consul Gaius Hostilius Mancinus. The consul was pinned down by the enemy and, unable to escape, made a peace treaty. Tiberius negotiated the peace terms. The treaty was rejected by the Senate as a disgrace. Plutarch wrote that the relatives and friends of the soldiers, who formed a large part of the people, blamed this on Mancinus and insisted that it was due to Tiberius that the lives of so many citizens had been saved. Those who disagreed with the violation of the treaty cast forth those who had taken hand and share in the treaty, as for instance the quaestors and military tribunes, turning upon their heads the guilt of perjury and violation of the pact. In the present affair, indeed, more than at any other time, the people showed their goodwill and affection towards Tiberius, for they voted to deliver up the consul unarmed and in bonds to the Numantines, but spared all the other offices for the sake of Tiberius. Scipio used his influence to help to save the men, but nonetheless he was blamed for not saving Mancinus, and for not insisting that the treaty with the Numantines, which had been made through the agency of his kinsman and friend Tiberius, should be kept inviolate. The Encyclopaedia Britannica suggests that Scipio Aemilianus was not in sympathy with the Optimates, the political faction which supported the aristocracy. Whatever the case, he was in disagreement with the militant actions of the movement led by Gracchus when he was a plebeian tribune, which pressed for a law to redistribute land to the poor. Plutarch wrote that this disagreement certainly resulted in no mischief past remedy, and thought that if Scipio had been in Rome during the political activity of Gracchus, the latter would not have been murdered. He was fighting the war in Hispania. Still, he disliked the actions of Gracchus. Plutarch wrote at Numantia, when he learned of the death of Tiberius, he recited in a loud voice the verse of Homer, "So may all who engage in such lawless conspiracies perish." Plutarch also wrote that when Caesar Fulvius asked him in an assembly of the people what he thought about the death of Tiberius, he made a reply which showed his dislike of the measures advocated by him. This made him unpopular. The people began to interrupt him as he was speaking, a thing which they had never done before, and Scipio himself was thereby led on to abuse the people. Gaius Papirius Carbo was a plebeian tribune, and Marcus Fulvius Flaccus was a senator sympathetic to the Gracchian cause. Scipio made himself unpopular again. Appian related that Fulvius Flaccus, Papirius Carbo and Tiberius's younger brother, Caius Sempronius Gracchus, shared a commission to implement the Gracchian law. There never had been a land survey, and landowners often did not have land deeds. The land was resurveyed. Some owners had to give up their orchards and farm buildings and go to empty land, or move from cultivated to uncultivated land or swamps. As anyone was allowed to work undistributed land, many tilled land next to their own, blurring the demarcation between public and private land. Rome's Italian allies complained about lawsuits brought against them and chose Scipio Aemilianus to defend them. As the allies had fought in his wars, he accepted. In the Senate, Scipio did not criticize the law, but argued that the cases should be heard by a court rather than the commission, which did not have the confidence of the litigants. This was accepted, and the consul Gaius Sempronius Tuditanus was appointed to give judgment. However, seeing that the job was difficult, he found a pretext to fight the war in Illyria. The people were angry because they saw a man in whose favor they had often opposed the aristocracy and incurred their enmity, electing him consul twice contrary to law, now taking the side of the Italian allies against themselves. His enemies claimed that he was determined to abolish the Gracchian law and was about to start armed strife and bloodshed. When the people heard these allegations, they were in a state of alarm until Scipio died at home in his bed. Then, according to Appian, he died without a wound. Appian wrote that it could not be known whether Scipio was murdered by Cornelia and her daughter Sempronia, who were worried that the Gracchian law might be repealed, or whether he committed suicide because he saw that he could not deliver on his promises. He added that OME say that slaves under torture testified that unknown persons were introduced through the rear of the house by night who suffocated him, and that those who knew about it hesitated to tell because the people were angry with him still and rejoiced at his death. Plutarch read that, although Scipio Africanus died at home after dinner, there is no convincing proof of the manner of his end, but some say that he passed away naturally, being of a sickly habit, some that he died of poison administered by his own hand, and some that his enemies broke into his house at night and smothered him. And yet Scipio's dead body lay exposed for all to see, and all who beheld it formed therefrom some suspicion and conjecture of what had happened to it. Quote, in another book, Plutarch wrote, no cause of such an unexpected death could be assigned. Only some marks of blows upon his body seem to intimate that he had suffered violence. The heaviest suspicions fell on Fulvius Flaccus, who, that very day, had reflected upon Scipio in a public address to the people. Gracchus also came under suspicion. However, this great outrage, committed upon the person of the greatest and most considerable man in Rome, was never either punished or inquired into thoroughly, for the populace opposed and hindered any judicial investigation, for fear that Keys should be implicated in the charge if proceedings were carried on. Gaius Papirius Carbo also came under accusation. During a trial, Lucius Licinius Crassus accused Carbo of being a party in the murder of Scipio. Ian Worthington rejects all these speculations and argues that Scipio Aemilianus died of natural causes. The man, Velleius Paterculus, read that Scipio was a cultivated patron and admirer of liberal studies and of every form of learning, and kept constantly with him, at home and in the field, two men of eminent genius, Publius and Panicius. No one ever relieved the duties of an active life by a more refined use of his intervals of leisure than Scipio, or was more constant in his devotion to the arts either of war or peace. Ever engaged in the pursuit of arms or his studies, he was either training his body by exposing it to dangers or his mind by learning. Polybius mentioned going to Africa with Scipio to explore the continent. Gellius wrote that Scipio used the purest diction of any man of his time. Cicero cited him among the orators who were a little more emphatic than the ordinary, never strained the lungs off, shouted. It seems that he had a good sense of humor, and Cicero cited a number of anecdotes about his puns. He is also a central character in Book V of Cicero's De Republica, a passage known as the Somnium Scipionis or Dream of Scipio. Culturally, Scipio Aemilianus was both progressive and conservative. He was the patron of the so-called Scipionic Circle, a group of 15 to 27 philosophers, poets, and politicians. Besides Roman satirists and comedy writers such as Lucilius and Terence, there were Greek intellectuals, such as the scholar and historian Polybius and the Stoic philosopher Panicius. Hence, Scipio had a Philhellenic disposition. Such disposition was criticized by Roman traditionalists who disliked the growing Hellenization of Rome, which they thought was corrupting Roman culture and life through alien influences, and advocated adherence to old Roman traditions and ancestral virtues, and mores. Yet, Scipio was also a supporter of such traditions and mores. Gellius read that when he was censor, Scipio made a speech urging the people to follow the customs of the forefathers. Quote, "He criticized several things which were done contrary to the usage of our forefathers, and found fault with adoptive sons being of profit to their adoptive father in gaining the rewards of paternity, and said, a father votes in one tribe, the son in another. An adopted son is of as much advantage as if one had a son of his own. Orders are given to take the census of absentees, and hence it is not necessarily for anyone to appear in person at the census." Gellius wrote that after he was censor, Scipio was accused before the people by Claudius Aetelius, a plebeian tribune, whom he had stripped of his knighthood during his censorship. He does not mention what the accusation was. Although under accusation, Scipio did not stop to shave and to wear white clothing and did not appear in the garb of those under accusation. He added that in those days noblemen started shaving in middle age. The satirist Lucilius wrote a verse about the episode. Thus base Aeschylus did great Scipio taunt, and lucky was his censorship and bad. Scipio Aemilianus will forever be associated with the destruction of Carthage.